and welcome to the Keys to Therapy. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different than past episodes. So, most episodes I've covered things that therapists should know, or things that would be very beneficial to their work, to trainings, to going into private practice, like different multiple areas of being a therapist. But one area I haven't covered so far has been recommendations for books or different things that can help you grow in that area. So typically in grad school, you'll be given a list of textbooks, and some professors will share different books that they really like to read. Or I see sometimes in the therapy Facebook groups, there will be things like, oh, does anybody have any recommendations for a book on this or that? And I think it's great to share resources and have almost like your own mini library of different books that not only you like and have learned from, but also that you can recommend to clients. Because, a lot of clients will ask, do you have a handout on this? Do you have any resources on that? So it's really good to kind of build your own little library, even if it's an Amazon checklist or whatever, of some different things, that different books and resources and stuff like that that you really like and enjoy and have been helpful to you. So for today's episode, I wanted to cover a book that I just recently read. Now, I really enjoy some of the therapy books, and I'll probably go over those in some future episodes too, so I can share some of my favorites with you guys. But I think sometimes it's really helpful to learn from people's stories who've been through it. And this isn't to discount any books that or are more educational or self-help. But with certain situations, reading firsthand accounts is totally different and is really enlightening in understanding the dynamics of what goes into a situation and how somebody can get through a situation, get into one, get through it, cope from it. So the book that I read this past week is called Dinner for Vampires. So if you've watched One Tree Hill in the past, which I loved growing up, Bethany Joy Lenz, she goes by Joy, she recently wrote this memoir all about her time in a cult. So at first, when you hear that, you're like, well, how'd she get into a cult? And she's a star. She'd been acting since she was a teenager, and she had a pretty successful career so far. So how would somebody like that get dragged into a cult? I think that's sort of what most people thought when she originally put out there that this is an experience that she had. Well, the book just came out last week, and since I liked the show and I've been following her story and listening to the podcast that she and the other girls from One Tree Hill are on, I really was intrigued by learning more about her story. So I wanted to cover a little bit of the book today and talk about it from a therapist's perspective for, not only the people who've gone through that situation, but I think it's, again, important for therapists to understand, reading somebody's firsthand account, how things develop. So the way that she describes the cult is very, very similar to a domestic violence type relationship. There's a power and control dynamic here that we see mostly in those types of situations. Now, there could be power and control dynamics that are really unhealthy in a professional setting, which she experienced on One Tree Hill as well, unfortunately. But there could be those kinds of dynamics with families. There's lots of different situations that you can be in. And so the premise of the book, while she's discussing being in a cult, she's also talking about being in a very abusive relationship and describes how she got there. Now, a lot of times in grad school or in different places that you may work or resources that you may have, you'll hear about domestic violence or you'll hear or learn about power and control, but it's on a very superficial level. Typically, most therapists do not have a lot of training on domestic violence. That's something very specialized that you have to typically seek out yourself unless you work at an agency that specializes in it and they train you. But for the most part, it is not something that is commonplace when you're in grad school. You don't take a class on it. You don't always, I don't think I had anything that covered it specifically. Yeah, I can't think of any class that really covered it specifically. There may have been the phrase thrown out, in a couple situations, role play scenarios, whatever we did, there was a few people, maybe one or two, I think, that had internships at a domestic violence center. So they would talk about it, but no one talked about cults at all. And no one talked about some of the similarities. So my point in bringing all of that up is this is an area that a lot of therapists and kind of people in general don't have a lot of knowledge of. And what is put out there in society is very black and white. Well, if it's a terrible situation, then leave it. If you're unhappy or you're being hurt, then get out of there. And they treat it very much like no question. Of course you would leave. But there's a lot of intricacies that happen. I think also sometimes people think a certain type of person ends up in those situations, in a cult or in a domestic violence situation or in some very unhealthy relationship dynamic. And that's not the case. There's not one prototype of a person who gets in those. There may be a lot of similarities amongst the people, but typically it could be anybody at any time. And I've noticed lately a lot more celebrities coming forward with their own stories of situations that they've been in. So I saw like Anna Kendrick this week, the actress from Pitch Perfect. She just discussed being in a 7-year relationship where there was a lot of abuse. So basically nobody is really safe from being in that situation. Anybody could be susceptible to it, essentially. So if you are wanting to learn more about these power and control dynamics, I would say definitely take the traditional educational stance on it, read up about the different types of interventions, and, you know, on that therapy side, definitely work on, you know, learning how to help people who have been through these situations, but also on the personal side, educate yourself more on it and make sure that there's no biases that you have that come through, because it will absolutely negatively impact your relationship with a client who has been through it or is going through it. So plus, I think that there's signs that you can read about in like a checklist in a screener or something like that in a training. But I think what's really helpful about reading memoirs and stuff like this book is you can see the trajectory of how it starts and what it looks like in different forms that give you very concrete examples versus what we've kind of all generalized, you know? And it's interesting because in the book, the author goes by Joy. And so she talks about how cults, and in interviews I've heard her say recently, like, you think of cult and you think of, you know, drinking the Kool-Aid, and you think of people in like these doing very like ritualistic things, long white gowns and very, you know, intricate rituals and protocols and stuff like that. And that just really wasn't the case with the group she belonged to. So we'll kind of get into her book on a therapeutic/human level. But I definitely recommend therapists seek out not only, again, the traditional resources, but get into specifically like reading people's stories, listening to their stories, and understanding all of the ways that these issues can manifest. So for Joy in particular, she starts the book off. There's a prologue that kind of jumps to her leaving her abusive husband, but it basically starts off with her childhood. So she describes a lot about how difficult it was being an only child and growing up with parents that had some difficulties within their relationship. She talks a lot about really wanting a sense of belonging, and being an only child, it was really difficult for her because she didn't really have that. And then they moved quite a bit for her dad's job. So Florida to Texas to New Jersey. And that also created a lot of turmoil as far as building a community for herself because she was always moving. And at that age and in that period of time, there wasn't cell phones and stuff like that and social media to keep up with people, which even that can be difficult to maintain relationships. But, you know, I think she was really struggling to find who she was and find that identity. And it seems like she was in her own world a lot. She mentions throughout the book and in interviews I've seen since that she had undiagnosed ADHD as a kid, and she describes a little bit of what that looked like for her. And ADHD is another thing that I think is really undiagnosed in women especially. So I read a statistic the other day. I don't know the number's 100% and how accurate it is. With research, I typically like to look at the source and how many people they polled and where and all of that. But I've seen these types of numbers consistently for years now. So it's something like most boys with ADHD get diagnosed in elementary school, typically like before the age of 7. And most women who have ADHD do not get a diagnosis until like late 20s or 30s, if at all. So I think because it's presented a little bit differently, I think sometimes in boys it may seem like maybe more apparent, or teachers and parents are looking for it more, and it's not always recognized, discussed, talked about in little girls. So for her particular, she was dealing with not only some of like the isolation and the loneliness of having moved to multiple places and not really having that community, but she also had ADHD, and that made things a little bit more difficult. So she also discusses having essentially dyslexia for numbers and that being an issue at school. So definitely for those of you that work with kids, understanding that some of these things may come into play and really screening the children that you're working with and asking more detailed questions than just what is on a traditional screener, but really understanding how it can manifest in kids, but especially little girls. So she said that she ended up getting into acting because it was a really good outlet for her. She really connected with her grandma, and she was really into all of that and had tons of playbills and stuff. So that was kind of the draw for her, which makes sense. A lot of kids who have those feelings of isolation, wanting to belong, they find communities that will help fulfill some of that for them. And I think a lot of kids, especially only children, it sounds like, they tend to try to find creative outlets, because when you have a sibling, you're making up stories, you're acting things out, you have that person right on hand to build that imagination with. And when you're an only child, that could be a little bit tougher. So she sought out a community with acting and got really into it. And throughout this time period, her parents had been having issues, and eventually they divorced. So then she was living solely with her mom, and they had some issues as well. Teenage girl, parents, lots of different things happening all personally for her, which is important later. But it just kind of sets the scene for some of the like upheaval and things that she experienced at that age. And very productive child being able to go out and work and do all these things, but at the same time, like, it definitely took a toll on her personally. It seems like, and definitely interpersonally as far as relationships go. So eventually she the day after she graduates high school, her mom is moving out of the house, tells her she's gonna have to get out because the mom sold the house. She's moving with her husband to California and she's gonna be gone. So Joy ends up moving to New York City by herself, because her job on a soap opera went from part-time to full-time. So then moving to a huge city and trying to find community, she has a very strong faith background. So that was where she decided to seek out community. So it sounds like she found a really good group there. That was a place that she felt she belonged. And eventually, career-wise, she wanted to make some different choices. So she moved to LA, where it seemed like there would be way more opportunities for her. But in doing so, she was again starting over in a new city, without that community, without family close by. And so all of that set her up to enter into this cult, which, of course, most of the time these things don't present themselves that way. And it started as like a small Bible study type group. She was having a lot of issues with auditions. She kept getting like second place when it would come to a part. She was the runner-up for a lot of big roles, but nothing was really sticking. It sounds like she had some minor roles here and there, but nothing like really consistent or long-term. So having all those insecurities, really trying to find her people and her places there, struggling with how to have her faith in a city that really does not encourage it, or in an industry that doesn't really encourage it, was tough. So she ended up going to a small Bible study where she felt a lot of connection. She felt that sense of belonging. So when this man came in from another state who was a pastor who was friends with the family that she was studying with, it's like he sort of over time took over. He praised her a lot. He showed her a lot of attention. He had brought his family to a lot of these events and Bible studies. So there was like, here's a sense of community. There was dinners together. There was all of these things that kind of filled that void that she'd had. And I think that really was the recipe for her then getting into this group longer term. So looking at clients of yours that are in those beginning stages of being more vulnerable, having that isolation, not really having that community, maybe struggling with their faith and what that means, not having the best relationship with their family, not having a lot of outlets, not feeling fulfilled in their career, any and all of those things could potentially be risk factors for obviously the big things we think of like depression and anxiety, but it can also put them at risk for being taken advantage of, for compromising their own values, for potentially entering into some sort of abusive situation or relationship. So again, on the therapy side of things, really looking for some of those criteria and helping the client empower themselves, helping them build that community in multiple ways so they don't become codependent on, a best friend or one particular place. Building up their self-worth and their identity, especially for somebody who was very young like her and had been in acting for so long and had moved to so many places, and she'd even like changed her name at one point in high school, to change the spelling of it, and tried to identify in a different way. Like there's just a lot of stuff that really shows that there was a feeling of being lost there. So if you're working with young clients, and honestly I've seen this with clients too who are more towards middle age, like they've been divorced, they have empty nest syndrome, whatever it is, and now they're going through their own kind of identity exploration. It's very similar. So paying attention to some of those qualities if you're seeing them in a client. So then as the book goes on, and I'm going to try to run through it quickly because I would rather you guys read it, but also, don't want to spend every second on it. Understanding, like I said, what some of those things look like. So over time, as the group builds, there was like some manipulation tactics, inviting some people to the big house in another state, and then, not inviting others. Including her at one point to like her friend's wedding even. So little things to kind of make it feel like this is the exclusive group and you're outside of it. So once you get pulled into that group and you're now invited to the things, you feel special, you feel welcomed, you feel like you've earned something and you don't want to lose it. So I think there was a lot of manipulation on the cult leader's part to bring her in. And he used a lot of religious phrases. He used a lot of language that would appeal to her faith, but I think there was just so much self-doubt with where she was at in her life that a lot of the things she just took at face value. I think she also didn't want to upset the family that she's like wanted to have this entire time. I know she details in one part of the book like being there for Christmas and having, gifts that everyone hand makes and does Secret Santa and music and food and just all of these people in this beautiful huge house. And that was something that she didn't really experience growing up. Now I say the house was beautiful, it was big. I think there was aspects it sounds like that were beautiful, but there was a lot of signs there that she ignored, like the house was actually kind of run down when it looked like it had been really amazing at one point. And there were certain personality things that weren't a fit. And I think she kind of learned along the way to not trust her own instincts. I think that was something she struggled with anyway, but definitely under this cult leader's supervision, essentially, he made sure that she and the others really did not listen to or trust what they were feeling, because that went against God, which actually went against him, but he kind of equated them as the same. So again, on the clinical side of things, making sure that you're helping your clients hone their instincts and understand what like those gut reactions are to things and how to respond to that, and empowering them to listen to that and to be able to figure out what to do with it when it does come up. Giving them like the assertive language and the tools to speak up for themselves, to set boundaries, things like that are really, really important. And it's so unfortunate that she didn't have those opportunities then. So there's a lot of points in her story where looking back she can see, and then of course the reader can see where these cracks were and how things ended up getting as bad as they did. So eventually she gets the job on One Tree Hill, so she moves to Wilmington, North Carolina. In the book she describes the cult being in Idaho. I think in reality it was in Washington State, because she changes a lot of the details and the names, but either way, kind of being on the opposite side of the country from where she was filming, and a lot of her insecurities and concerns kind of played into her ability to really bond with the cast, which is sad, because I think she even says in a few points like she really regrets how isolated she became and how much she pushed most of the people away who could have been like really great friends to her then. Luckily they are now, but I think it's really tough. So she ends up marrying the cult leader's son because everyone's getting paired off. She had a lot of like fear of missing out on where she thought she should be in life, how things should go for her. And this is something I consistently see with clients, especially younger clients, because they're so exposed to everything and anything that's going on in the world. Who's getting married? When are people having kids? When are they buying houses? When are they getting their dream careers, cars, clothes, whatever? And they're comparing themselves constantly. So it feels like they're just never doing enough in their minds. They're not where they should be or thought they would be based off of some metric that they've put in their heads, from social media or whatever else. So there was a lot of pieces of that she was experiencing, to the point she convinced herself that she liked the cult leader's son. And of course he went for it, because this was an opportunity for his son to marry the most financially successful person in the group. So she kind of forces this marriage, again, does not trust her gut, her instincts, and immediately realizes like this is not a good fit for her. They have intimacy issues. They have conflicting views on almost everything. They cannot get along. He's very controlling. And that's when the relationship from the get-go basically turns into something very abusive emotionally. So there's a lot of frustrations with her in regards to him, and when she tries to open up to friends about it, he gets upset. And that's something that you commonly see in abusive relationships. There needs to be isolation and control. So she was getting that from there. She was also getting it like from the church, or from this group that she was a part of, and she was also getting it from her husband, while at the same time experiencing a really toxic work environment on set. The creator of One Tree Hill, and this has been well documented, with the Me Too movement, things came out about him from the show he was currently working on, and then the cast of One Tree Hill all put together a letter, and they've spoken multiple times on the podcast and in interviews about how abusive he was, sexually assaulting and harassing some of the female cast members, put like a lot of manipulation, threatening them. And even with the whole cast together, telling them constantly they were going to be canceled, so that the show was going to be canceled, so that he felt like he had a lot of power over them, and he had to keep them in line. Like, there was a lot of really bad stuff that came from that. So she was dealing with it in pretty much every facet of her life, and it was normalized, even though everything in her gut was telling her it wasn't. So over time, her husband's on her bank accounts, then it turned into financial abuse. He was controlling some of the accounts. His family was in charge of the accounts as well, managing her money and some of the other people. So it became then a financial situation of, she can't buy things for the house because they need to be saving money or putting money elsewhere. And it was her money. Her husband had never held a job. So just things like that really all like played on top of each other. So eventually they have a baby, and things just get worse, not better. And overall, that's her having a baby is the thing that really breaks them apart, because now she's got this other person to look out for, and that causes a shift in her mindset. She was on the cult for the entire 9 seasons of One Tree Hill, and then decides to separate from him after he'd had multiple violent outbursts and threatened her, punched holes in walls, all kinds of just very domineering stuff. And that's the other thing, is a lot of times when therapists, if they're not educated, people in general, but definitely therapists, it's especially important to educate yourself on what domestic violence looks like, because it's not always physical. And I've had many clients who have been in emotionally abusive situations that have said things like, well, at least he doesn't hit me. Well, I mean, it's not like I've ever been hurt, or he's thrown things near me, but not at me. comments like that, it's your job to, one, understand what those signs of emotional abuse and physical abuse look like, intimidation, all of those things on that power and control wheel. You have to have a really good understanding of it. Because if you don't, you're not going to be able to help the client really understand what that looks like and what their experience is. And that's not going to help treatment at all. So she does say around this point in time, she went to therapy, and her therapist helped point out, like, this is not a healthy situation. Like, this is abusive. This is not right. This is not how things are supposed to be, and helped her work on a plan essentially to get out of that situation. So that's another reason why I think it's so important for therapists to understand, like, you may have a crucial role in this person's life, helping them understand like where they're at. And there's a lot of things you need to be aware of. So you tread very lightly. It's very tough. Some people are not ready to leave right away. Sometimes there's a lot of other factors, whether it is financial, whether it's social, whether it's family, whether it's spiritual, whatever it is, like things that might be holding them back or preventing them from really making that jump. And, you know, the more that you understand about what that looks like, the easier it'll be. Same with the work environment, right? I'm sure there were people that, had they understood what was going on, would have told her, or had told her and some of the other cast members, to quit. But one, they were under contract, so it wasn't that easy. But also, I think it's like, well, that's your job. So what do you do? Can you secure another job before you quit this one? Will they pay you as much? Will you be able to still sustain the life that you've been building, pay your bills? So making sure you as a therapist understand like the entire view of this person's life, and not give them suggestions that are as trite as like, well, just find another job, or you will be in another relationship in the future, or something like that, that just like really minimizes and invalidates their feelings and experiences. So she ends up leaving him, finds out that he and the cult stole over $2 million from her. She has like $220,000 left out of years and years of working. And like I said, she hadn't really been spending money because they told her she couldn't. So now there's this whole financial aspect. And then she goes through custody battles. And I know that's something, as a therapist, most of the time you're going to have some client who's either been through it, is going through it. They were the child who experienced it. It's just very commonplace. So it's interesting to hear her perspective on the courts and what she had to endure for that. And then she started working on rebuilding her life. So finding more community, reaching out to family members who she'd spent years pushing away, building new relationships, figuring out her faith and what that looks like after it had been tainted for so long under this group and this control. Learning to talk about the things that they were all kind of told not to. There was one point where the cult leader said that there were illegal questions, things that they shouldn't be asking themselves or questioning themselves or the leaders about. So a lot of kind of undoing some of the brainwashing that they had attempted to do with them. And so she does mention at the end having a lot of pushback as she became more honest about what she experienced, that people were like, that's so stupid. I would never be dumb enough to get in a cult. And, you know, only like small people fall for that, and things that just like really tore her down and minimized her experiences. And it's like, again, as a therapist, making sure that you aren't doing those things. You're not passing judgment in that way with your clients, personally or professionally. Like, there's so many circumstances. And again, this is why I think it's so important to read real people's stories. Because if you're reading checklists and definitions and even like 2-paragraph case studies on what these things look like, you're not going to have a whole picture of it. You're not going to be able to read somebody's innermost thoughts and feelings. You're not going to understand that trajectory, because it's not like somebody's like, I'm going to join a cult, or that guy's really abusive, I'm going to get in a relationship with him. That's not how it goes. It's an entire process, and it's usually a slow burn. And people like to use sometimes in those situations like that metaphor of like the frog that is in the boiling water. You don't throw him into the boiling pot. You put him in the pot, so sick, and you slowly turn up the temperature until finally he's burning, right? That's what happens to people in these situations the majority of the time. And as a clinician, it's really important for you to understand that. And it builds more empathy for you as a therapist too, to read somebody's stories, to, again, hear their innermost thoughts, to see how it affected every aspect of their life, to gain a better understanding of all of the ways that these behaviors show up. So to you, it's not just that power and control wheel. And you're like, okay, yep, I see intimidation. I see this. It's like, no, what does intimidation look like? Well, it looks like the entire family, when she was going to make a decision about a job she really wanted, the cult leader didn't want her to take it. And so he told the entire family, everybody else in the group, not to speak to her. So they all ignored her for weeks. And that made her scared that she was truly going to lose him. So she turned down her dream job. So those types of things that are so layered and nuanced, it really helps to have the actual examples of it and to learn from that. Plus, if at some point you have a client who's been through a similar situation, or they feel, really alone and they're trying to understand or grasp it, it can be very helpful to give them something that's not just a therapy type book on a topic, but something that's somebody's story that they might read that and be like, oh my God, well, if she can go through this, like a major TV actress, like why couldn't I? So yeah, I think the book overall was really good. I feel like she was really honest. She was really vulnerable. She was very open about her experiences. And even though some of them were probably, and she said in interviews since, like maybe kind of embarrassing to share, didn't paint her in the best light, definitely made her feel very insecure about certain decisions she's made. Maybe some shame associated with how the whole thing turned out, with how she treated her family, with Cass, like different things like that. It's really important and puts a very human face on some of these like buzzwords essentially, or niches or whatever that we have in grad school or in your practices or your jobs. It's not just like, oh, domestic violence. It's like, no, here's what that looks like, and here's how it can show up, and here's who can be susceptible to it. So I'll probably do a few other books that I've read and some different, situation, documentaries, whatever it is, of things that I've come across. But definitely recommend as a therapist that you have, again, your little library of books that are evidence-based and written by researchers and psychologists and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, we're working with people, and we really need to hear other people's stories. I think it's, again, humanizes these diagnoses and these different like medical model type of criteria that we've been educated on and are sometimes forced to use, can help us like broaden those horizons. So again, Dinner for Vampires, Bethany Joy Lenz, great read, really interesting to learn more of the insights into what cult life is like. And this was a very subtle cult compared to some of the ones that are branding people and drugging people, and some of these like crazy documentaries that are out here about these leaders who are in jail for the most part, as they should be. But I think it's definitely a really good piece on how this subtle kind of insidious cults and manipulation and stuff looks like. So highly recommend it. But if you've read the book, I'd love to hear your thoughts below. If you do end up getting it, definitely comment. Let me know where you're at. I think you'll be I'm curious to hear what other therapists' thoughts are on it, especially. But if you want to follow along with future episodes, then go ahead and hit subscribe. And I will see you next time. Thanks. Bye.